The Tennessee Volunteers are on an absolute heater right now after landing David Sanders Jr., the #1 offensive tackle in the land. They also got a flip from Jaden Harmon, who's from Rome, Georgia, who was committed to Bama. Now he's at Tennessee. It's been a heck of a week for the Volunteers. And if you're a Volunteer fan, you have got to be absolutely ecstatic with the way Josh Heupel and company are recruiting. But what I want to talk about today is, why is Tennessee recruiting so well? Why are they able to land the guys that they're landing? Why do they have the #5 class in the land? And we can start with David Sanders and talk about his recruitment, but it's not just David Sanders. It's everybody in this class. And so we're going to talk about it. So let's just start with David Sanders. How did they land David Sanders? In my opinion, one of the reasons was they started early and they finished strong. Tennessee has been notorious for starting early, and they've been really good when it comes to identifying talent and saying who they want and recruiting well and getting people to like Tennessee early. Let's flash back to the summer, COVID summer, 2020. In the summer, Tennessee had the #1 rated class, and then it just totally falls apart. All right. There's a reason, and we know about the Pruitt era and all of that, but they recruited well early, and some of the other stuff we're not going to talk about. We're just talking about strictly identifying talent and connecting with talent. Okay, cool. So here comes Josh Heupel. Takes that same mentality as far as identifying talent and starting early. They got in, like, David Sanders was somebody who was contacted, or the initial contact with Tennessee came before he even stepped on the football field as a ninth grader. All right. Josh Heupel took that mantle and continued and made sure that his staff was able to, hey, this is our guy, regardless of if somebody thinks he's going to Georgia, regardless if Nebraska is in the league, no, regardless if Ohio State is making a push. This is our guy. They took ownership of David Sanders' recruitment before he committed. And I think that's really important to do that early and to be consistent throughout. You also got to talk about having the same energy from the start to finish. Anytime that I talked to a Tennessee staffer about David Sanders, they had the same energy from the time he was in 10th grade to right now. There was always like this excitement when you heard a staffer from Tennessee talk about David Sanders and their pretty much like their possibility of getting them, but also about him and their family. Anytime I talked anytime I talked to somebody from Tennessee, there was like it was almost like David Sanders was already a part of the family. And I think that's important. So the more Tennessee continues to start early and finish strong, more importantly, you're going to see these type of classes continue to roll in. And David Sanders is the second highest rated recruit ever for Tennessee. This is huge. And now you're just going to see more and more people say, hey, the way they closed on David Sanders, if they continue to do this, that now they go from the team that's getting 1 or 2 5-stars a class to possibly getting 3 or 4. And you know, once you start to kind of creep up with those 5 stars, the blue chippers follow, and now you become a destination. I always talk about you want to become a destination location, and that's what Tennessee is becoming right now. All right. The second part of why I think Tennessee is recruiting so well is their on and off-field staff. Josh Heupel has every right to operate like a CEO. That offense has been one of the most electric offenses over the past couple of years in the entire college football landscape. He is dialed in. When you see him on the sidelines, you know whose offense that is. I think that is so important. But also the fact that he's able to call that type of offense that garners recruits, that has receivers want to come play for him, that has quarterbacks want to come play for him, but still recruit. So think about this. Starbucks recently fired their CEO, $100 million type guy, fired him. Why? Because he goes out on a podcast and says, I don't work after a certain amount of time. There's nothing you can do to make me work after a certain amount of time. he had a CEO mindset. That's somebody else's job. I'm going to delegate these things. Josh Heupel isn't doing that. Josh Heupel is getting his hands dirty. Josh Heupel, even though he has this great offense, the thing that helps you with Josh Heupel being a guy that helps that has this offense, but also has the pulse of recruiting, he can sell it in a way that an offensive coordinator can't. He can sell it in a way that a position coach can't. And he's doing that. Right now, I've talked to over 80 of the top players in the entire 25 class. Every time I talk to a player from Tennessee, they always mention Josh Heupel. It's a consistent thing. Even when he doesn't get a guy, they still talk about the relationship that they built with Josh Heupel. If that's where you're starting at, a guy who knows that in order to recruit against the Kirby Smart, who knows that if you're recruiting against Ryan Day, if you're recruiting against even a Mike Norvell, if you're recruiting against a Kalen DeBoer, you cannot turn your phone off at a certain time. You got to be ready. And it shows. So now you got this guy, the CEO, who's working late, playing basketball with recruits on visits and beating them. You heard that on the 5-Star Flex. You've got a guy here. Well, that trickles down. So now once you get past Josh Heupel, who's had contact with all of these recruits, now you get into the position coaches and the coordinators. You get a guy like Kelsey Pope, a younger guy, who was really instrumental in getting a guy like Mike Matthews the year before, a younger guy. Then you mix him with a guy like Rodney Garner, a grizzled veteran who's been in plenty of recruiting battles. Auburn was the guy who got Derek Brown to Auburn. When you talk about the defensive line guys that he had at the University of Georgia, he's bringing all that experience. Okay, now we want to go experience again. Okay, let's go Willie Martinez, who's been all over the country and knows every back alley when it comes to different high schools and where to go find people and who's the guy you need to call in order to get a recruit. Then you got, so you're going experience again. Then you get a guy like Alex Abelin. Now, how did you get to Son Brown? That's how you got him. Another young guy. So what they're doing is they're fusing a young energy, a young portion of their staff in with a more experienced type of approach. When you talk about the Willie Martinez's and you talk about the Rodney Garners, and you're getting this fusion where you're able to relate on different levels. If you have a parent who may be a little older, who has a younger student athlete, well, you can kind of mix and match there. And I think that's really important to not have too much of anything on a recruiting staff. So once you get off, and not even to mention Tim Banks, the DC, super cool guy. So once you get past the on-field staff, who's going to be calling, who's going to be sending texts, who's going to be showing up to your school on the road when there's when it's open, it's not dead, who's going to actually be at the in-home visits. Then when you go to Tennessee, they blitz you with the off-field staff. You got a guy like LaVon Harbin, who's always been with Rodney Garner, who was always instrumental in recruiting. They call him Poke Chop. He's the type of guy that you want around when you have a family-type atmosphere because he's like an uncle, a really cool uncle. Then you talk about a guy like Steven Ruzick, who's been at Auburn, who's been at North Carolina, who was even at Indiana, so he got to learn the Midwest. And I'm going to tell you why that's important in a minute. Who's been constantly on these top 30 for 30 lists. Top 30, under 30, excuse me. You get a guy like Ruzick. Then you got Danny O'Rourke. These are all off-field guys. Like Tennessee is building something special when it comes to recruiting, and it's showing. All right. I know I sound a little bit excited, but I love this type of stuff, man. Like you got to forgive me. But what Tennessee is doing more than anything that I really love is that they're recruiting with a national imprint. David Sanders, where is he from? Charlotte. Douglas Utu, who is from Las Vegas. Now, a lot of people are talking about David Sanders, but we're forgetting about Doug. Big Doug, Utu, excuse my pronunciation. He's the type of guy that could have been an anchor or a cornerstone for a recruiting class on the offensive line himself. He's a top 5 interior offensive lineman, like compositely. I'm telling you, this guy's a baller. Now you put him with a guy like David Sanders, you have two stalwarts on the offensive line for years to come to protect George McIntyre, who's also a five-star type quarterback, who's been really, really instrumental in recruiting. When you look at Tennessee's recruiting class currently, they only have, of their top 11 players, they only have two guys from the state of Tennessee. They're recruiting Las Vegas. They're recruiting Indiana. They're recruiting Charlotte. They're recruiting Georgia really well when you look at Travis Smith, who just went off for about 270 yards against Langston Hughes, like a straight baller, and who also has a teammate who's another 6'3" receiver. It's almost impossible to stop those guys when they're throwing the ball. But yeah, you look at what they're doing in Georgia. You look at what they're doing with a guy like Shady Hayward, a safety who's really, really athletic. I think he's probably one of the most freakish athletes in the state this year. With Jaden Harmon, like they're recruiting everywhere. And it started with Nico. You go pull Nico. And how did you get Nico? Well, one, and what was important about Nico? Let me start there. What was important was you were able to go across country and bring the top quarterback in the class to Tennessee. That was huge. What it did was it took that T, it took that logo from Knoxville to California. Everybody in the country had to see that. That was huge. Now, fast forward a couple of years later, it's not so outlandish to see a guy who may not be in your recruiting footprint want to come to Tennessee. Another reason, Nico made headlines when it came down to the NIL. Tennessee ain't shy about NIL. Their collective is not shy about letting you know, hey, what we say is what we're going to do. Case in point, Jalen Rashada, from who's had the big deal with Florida, right? Didn't get paid, goes to Arizona State, now he's at Georgia. A huge deal made about all of this money, and it was at the birth of NIL, and it was, oh, why is he getting paid all this money, and are they going to be able to pay it? And no, they can't pay it, so we've got to transfer. Nico got a big deal too, but guess what? There wasn't a word said. The check was good. So everywhere you see that T, the collective, the check is good. And I think that works wonders when it comes to recruiting with the national imprint. It's not all about the money, because when you're recruiting 5 stars, everybody has the cachet to recruit them. Everybody has resources. But Tennessee being able to say, look at these two situations. You come to Tennessee, the check is going to clear. The collective is going to be sure of that. So now when you recruit with a national imprint, that only helps you going into somebody else's backyard and saying, hey, look, you want to play in front of 100,000? Oh, and not to mention, they're also building like this, almost like a football metropolis around Neyland Stadium right now. That's similar to like what the Braves have with the Battery, how you can go to out to the Braves field, to the Braves Stadium early in the day, stay to the game, stay all night, party, whatever you want to do, kick it with the family. Now they're setting that up in Knoxville. This is going to be a completely different game day situation than we've ever seen. Tennessee is on a heater. And from what I see, it's not about to stop anytime soon. This is a very exciting time to be a Tennessee fan.